I'm delighted today to be able to introduce Christian Levett, a friend of ICRA, a great supporter, and a terrific collector. His interests are many and varied, but his prime focus is in the field of antiquities. In fact, he has dedicated a museum to this field in Mougins in the south of France. So let's jump right in. Christian, I know you have two objects from the collection that you would like to share with us today. So my question to you is this: what role did Provenance play in their acquisition?
Thank you, Teresa, for your very kind words. Well, Provenance is tremendously important in the purchase of any artwork of any type. It's particularly important, I would say, in antiquities, because you tend to have a sort of another level of trickiness with the object's background, given the fact that it's come out of the ground. And at some point has been exported from a particular country in the past. And many countries, particularly in the Mediterranean, have laws which prevent antiquities from being exported at all. And when something's found within their land, they basically take it as government cultural property. So there was a convention in 1970 by UNESCO that sort of created a sort of watershed between what was acceptable provenance and what wasn't. So generally museums these days will look, even for loans, let alone purchases, but particularly for purchases for pre-1970 provenance. Of course, that depends on the country. The UK, for example, is particularly tight on that. The US is a lot lighter on that. And then there's a sort of varying degrees amongst the other sort of European countries and countries around the world. But therefore one is exposed to sort of an extra level over and above the potential for the piece to have been Nazi loot, for example, or a forgery of some kind. You sort of have the added layer of, was it exported correctly and legally at that time of export. So it's particularly important. I think that within the antiquities market, though, you know, many people collect antiquities, may go to an art fair, buy an antiquity or two here and there, walk into a gallery on Madison Avenue or Bond Street or in those areas. And you know, these things are not in the forefront of their mind. They're sort of novice collectors, etc. And when I started buying antiquities, I fell into the slightly novice category in the early to mid 2000s, even though I was relatively experienced in buying other forms of art at that point. So, so one can be sort of, you know, forgiven for that. So the first piece that I'd like to talk about was a sort of early-ish purchase of mine, which is a bust of Lucius Verus. That I bought in 2008. So this particular piece had a provenance going back to around 2002. And this is a provenance that I wouldn't accept these days. Quite the opposite, in fact. And but I bought it from a dealer in 2008 in New York. He'd bought it from another dealer in Paris in 2002. Mm-hmm. And that dealer had said that it had been around since the 19th century, likely due to restorations on it, which looks correct, and didn't really give too much more detail than that. So within our museum, since it's been open in 2011, we've done an enormous amount of sort of provenance research on all the pieces that have been in the museum, several hundred pieces. And really try to get to grips with where pieces have been prior to me buying them. That's come up with some things which have not been correct, I have to say. And there's been pieces where we've been able to greatly improve the provenance. This, thankfully, being one. So we then questioned the dealer in Paris. We found out that they bought it from a dealer in Leeds, who had bought it from a dealer in France, in the south of France, or he'd acquired it in the south of France. The chateau that I'd been given the name of when I purchased it in 2008 was a Chateau Pierre Dom, and it was in a village in the south of France, in Provence. We then tried to contact that chateau, and in fact there was 3 Chateau Pierre d'Ans in Provence, none of which were in that particular village. And so we had to try and contact those other 3 chateaux then in these 3 different villages and find out if it had been in one of them at all. So maybe the provenance had a sort of stopped there. None of them were responding to us. The very efficient ladies that I employ in the museum sent sort of multiple letters, handwritten, as well as trying to find other methods of contacting the various owners, and in the end started knocking on their doors at these various chateaux, and eventually found the chateau that it had thankfully indeed been in. It was captured at Abbey de Pierre d'Ans in Mougins in Provence, which was nice provenance. And then we found out that Abbey was owned by Jean-Martin Roch, and that he had indeed bought it from family references and family letters that we were able to get access to in the 1960s, which was lucky that it predated the 1970 UNESCO agreements, which often dealers put that provenance goes back prior to that because it's a convenient date to choose. But in this case, it was genuine, thankfully. And indeed, quite clearly anyway, as the dealer correctly said that had owned it in Paris prior to the one that I bought it from in New York, it had clearly been out of the ground for a very long time and undergone restoration, etc., etc. So, you know, our provenance research on that piece, you know, came up very well, even though actually we only know where it's been since the early 1960s. So, but it's good enough provenance that now it can be sold just about anywhere. And that's quite dangerous these days, buying something that only has, let's say, a 2002 provenance, because neither of the major auction houses will take it. Sotheby's generally looks for a piece to have evidence, at least, that it's been around since prior to 1970. And Christie's won't sell a piece in the last 4 or 5 years unless it has guaranteed paperwork that is provable to the year 2000. And in fact, even if you bought a piece from Christie's, even a valuable piece, let's say in 2005, and they sold it to you without having the correct documentation themselves, they will not resell it for you. Even if they sold it to you in 2005, saying that it had been around since the 1960s or 1980s, Christie's will not resell it for you. You are stuck with it. And also, most of the major dealers these days will also not resell an antiquity that only has or has less than 20 years provenance. Certainly nothing that's of any value. So it is tremendously important these days. I previously or had provable paperwork with regard to an antiquity, just to be able to resell it, and particularly to be able to resell it at either Christie's or Sotheby's. And Bonhams is also getting tighter on their provenance paperwork, and pretty much has headed in the same direction as Christie's, I think, without making it 100% firm rule as far as I'm aware. But certainly they're of the same kind of inkling. So by the time I purchased object number 2 in 2011 at Maastricht, my needs for sort of paperwork and provenance have become much tighter. And in fact, in recent years, I've generally only bought published pieces, and I've generally only bought them if they have published prior to 1970. So that's how tight I've got. The market in general for antiquities has also got much stronger on provenance, and that's therefore polarized the pricing of antiquities. So things that have very short provenance, even though there might not be nothing wrong with them otherwise, have become increasingly difficult to sell, and or their prices have dropped. Whereas things which have fantastic provenance, the sky is the absolute limit on pricing. So the divergence between 2 pieces, let's say of a similar quality, but in terms of paperwork, has become extraordinarily polarized. So provenance with an antiquity, I would say, is more paramount than it is with anything, even though it's paramount with any artwork. So just to finish off, the bronze head of Augustus that I have here, I purchased at Maastricht from a dealer called Gordian Weber in 2011. This was found in Rome in 1880 by a known archaeologist at the time, published at the time in 1880, published again in 1888, published again in 1937, published again in the 1940s on 2 occasions, and subsequently published consistently since. It comes from a famous excavation in Rome and a famous group of bronze heads of emperors, all the others of which I believe are in museums. I think there was 5 or 6. And it's probably one of the most important bronze heads that's Roman in private hands. And therefore, the provenance for this is bulletproof. And therefore, the value of this particular piece, I would have thought, is up 6 to 10 times on what I paid for it. Mm-hmm. And that is the value on looking for pieces with long-term published history, tremendously important antiquities.
Fascinating, Christian. That's just amazing. First of all, congratulations on having these 2 wonderful objects in your collection, but also for your tenacity in tracking down the provenance, which is can often be a Herculean task. And I think we understand much better the financial implications of a poor, faulty, incomplete provenance, and how the premium on provenance is really quite profound. So thank you for all of that to our attention and to the attention of all of our viewers today. And it's been lovely seeing you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Teresa.